There is something deeply unsettling about the narcissist's confidence. Not ordinary confidence, the healthy kind that allows a person to build, lead, or persevere through hardship, but the kind rooted in the belief that they stand above correction itself. The narcissist does not merely want admiration, they want exemption. Exemption from accountability, exemption from humility, exemption from truth. They construct an identity so carefully polished that over time they begin worshipping their own reflection. And this is where the danger truly begins, because the greatest deception is not lying to others, it is successfully lying to oneself. What makes narcissism spiritually dangerous is that it often disguises itself as strength. The narcissist can appear composed, persuasive, intelligent, even morally superior. They know how to perform goodness without possessing it deeply. They know how to imitate empathy when it benefits them. They know how to wear virtue like clothing. But image man, agement is not character. And eventually every false identity reaches the moment where performance can no longer sustain reality. That is one of the oldest principles woven into human existence. Whatever is false requires constant maintenance. Truth stands by itself. Lies must be defended endlessly. The narcissist lives in exhausting contradiction. They demand loyalty while giving none. They demand understanding while refusing self-examination. They crave admiration yet resent anyone who shines too brightly beside them. And because they cannot tolerate the idea of being flawed, they begin rewriting reality around their ego. Every criticism becomes an attack. Every boundary becomes betrayal. Every disagreement becomes disrespect. Slowly, they lose the ability to see people as human beings and instead see them as mirrors, objects that either reflect praise or deserve punishment. And here is the tragedy most people miss. Pride does not enlarge the soul, it shrinks it. A proud person, I occupy enormous space socially, emotionally, even financially. But internally they become smaller and smaller because their entire existence revolves around protecting a fragile illusion. That is why narcissists are often hypersensitive beneath the arrogance. Their confidence is not built on truth, it is built on defense. And anything built on defense eventually collapses under pressure. This is why divine judgment often begins long before visible consequences appear. People assume judgment means lightning from heaven, immediate destruction, public humiliation. But some of the most severe forms of judgment begin invisibly. A person can already be collapsing inwardly, while still appearing successful outwardly. They can possess influence yet have no peace. They can command attention yet remain spiritually hollow. They can win arguments while losing their soul. The narcissist rarely sees this happening because pride blinds perception. In fact, the more pride grows, the less self-worth. NS survives. They interpret their temporary success as proof that they are untouchable. They mistake delayed consequences for permanent immunity. But delay is not denial. Silence is not approval. And time has a remarkable way of exposing what arrogance tries desperately to conceal. History, philosophy, and scripture repeatedly return to the same warning. When a human being places themselves at the center of reality, destruction quietly begins. Not because humility is weakness, but because humility keeps a person connected to truth. The narcissist rejects humility because humility requires surrender, the admission that one is not supreme, not flawless, not above moral law. And yet reality always wins its war against illusion. Eventually the manipulator encounters someone they cannot control. Eventually the performance slips. Eventually relationships grow cold. Eventually admiration fades. Eventually the emptiness they spent years outrunning catches up to them in silence. And perhaps the most terrifying part is this. Many narcissists do not recognize their downfall even while living inside it. They continue blaming others, attacking critics, and defending illusions while their inner world deteriorates piece by piece. Because when pride becomes a lifestyle, truth itself begins to feel like persecution. That is why the hidden pride of the narcissist is so dangerous. It does not simply corrupt behavior, it corrupts perception. It convinces a person that they are the victim of every consequence they created. It hardens the conscience until conviction feels offensive. And once a person loses the ability to examine themselves honestly, they begin drifting further and further away from wisdom, peace, and ultimately God. The frightening reality is not that the narcissist thinks too highly of themselves. The frightening reality is that they stop seeing themselves truthfully at all. And a person who can no longer face truth is already standing at the edge of judgment. One of the greatest misunderstandings people have about judgment is that they imagine it arriving dramatically and all at once. They expect catastrophe to descend like a storm everyone can immediately recognize. But in reality, some of the most severe judgment begins quietly, internally, almost invisibly. It starts in the hidden architecture of the mind and soul long before it manifests in circumstances. And this is precisely why many narcissists never see it coming. They are trained to measure life externally: status, admiration, control, appearance, influence. As long as those things remain intact, they assume they are winning. But a person can appear powerful while disintegrating internally. That internal collapse is often the beginning of judgment. The narcissist spends years constructing an identity designed to dominate perception. They become experts at controlling environments, conversations, and emotional dynamics. But maintaining a false self requires enormous psychological energy. It is exhausting to constantly manipulate reality so that the ego remains protected. Every interaction becomes strategic. Every relationship becomes transactional. Every criticism becomes a threat to survival. And eventually the mind begins to suffer under the weight of its own performance. This is why narcissists are often deeply restless people beneath the surface. Even when they appear calm, there is usually an undercurrent of anxiety, suspicion, irritability, or emptiness running underneath. Because when a person builds their identity on superiority rather than truth, peace becomes impossible. Peace only exists where honesty exists. A divided self cannot rest. The tragedy is that the narcissist interprets this inner instability incorrectly. Instead of recognizing it as the consequence of pride and self-deception, they blame everyone around them. If they feel empty, someone failed to admire them enough. If they feel angry, someone challenged their control. If they feel said someone became disloyal. They externalize every internal problem because self-examination feels unbearable. And this is where the punishment becomes severe in a way most people fail to understand. The narcissist gradually loses the ability to experience genuine human connection. They may still attract people, influence people, even impress people, but intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens the false self they have spent years protecting. So they remain emotionally isolated, even in crowded rooms. They become dependent on attention while simultaneously incapable of receiving love in a healthy way. Imagine the torment of needing constant validation, yet never feeling truly satisfied by it. That is not freedom. That is psychological captivity. There is also a profound spiritual dimension to this collapse. When a person repeatedly ignores truth, suppresses conscience, and manipulates others without repentance, something inside them hardens. At first, the conscience. Protests. Then it whispers. Eventually it grows quiet. Not because evil has become good, but because repeated self-deception numbs moral awareness. And a numb conscience is one of the most dangerous conditions a human being can experience. People often assume judgment means God is absent. Sometimes judgment means God allows a person to continue down the path they stubbornly insist upon. The narcissist demands absolute self-rule, and eventually they receive it. But a life disconnected from humility, truth, and love inevitably turns inward on itself. Pride begins consuming the very person who feeds it. You can already see this pattern in many narcissistic individuals as they age. Their world becomes smaller. Their relationships become more fragile. Trust disappears. Suspicion increases. They replay old conflicts endlessly because resentment becomes one of the few things keeping their ego energized. They struggle to experience joy because joy requires gratitude, and gratitude requires humility. Without humility, even blessings lose their meaning. And perhaps the most frightening part is that external success can temporarily hide internal ruin. A narcissist may still possess wealth, influence, beauty, or authority, while their inner world deteriorates beyond recognition. Society often mistakes visibility for wholeness. But there is a difference between being admired and being at peace. A person can stand in front of thousands and still be haunted by emptiness. This is why internal collapse is such a profound form of judgment. The narcissist becomes trapped inside the very false identity they created. The mask can no longer be removed because they no longer remember who they were underneath it. They spend their lives seeking power over others while losing mastery over themselves. And eventually the soul begins collecting the debt the ego refused to pay. The warning here is not merely about narcissists. It is about human nature itself. Every person is capable of drifting into pride, self-deception, and moral blindness if they stop pursuing truth honestly. The difference is that some people humble themselves before reality, while others wage war against it until reality breaks them, because the most dangerous prison in the world is the one built from your own unchecked pride. One of the cruel illusions narcissists create is the belief that the damage they cause simply disappears with time. They move through people's lives, leaving confusion, insecurity, emotional exhaustion, and shattered trust behind them, yet often behave as though nothing meaningful has occurred. They minimize wounds they inflicted. They rewrite history to protect their image. They portray themselves as misunderstood, while those they harmed are left carrying invisible scars. And because much of narcissistic abuse happens psychologically rather than physically, the suffering is often difficult for outsiders to recognize. But unseen pain is not unreal pain. In fact, some of the deepest injuries a human being can experience leave no visible mark at all. A narcissist has a way of slowly dismantling another person's confidence without them fully realizing it. They distort reality through manipulation, criticism, emotional withholding, humiliation, and control. Over time, victims begin doubting their instincts, questioning their worth, and apologizing for wounds they never caused. The narcissist does not merely seek influence over behavior, they seek influence over perception itself. That is why many survivors describe the experience not simply as heartbreak, but as psychological disorientation. They emerge feeling disconnected from themselves. Their inner compass becomes damaged because they spent so long adapting to someone else's ego. And perhaps what makes it even more painful is that narcissists frequently appear charming, respected, or convincing to the outside world. The victim suffers privately, while the narcissist protects their public image fully. But there is a profound moral truth many wounded people forget during this process. No act of cruelty disappears simply because it was ignored socially. Human systems fail constantly. People overlook injustice. Communities misjudge situations. Manipulators escape accountability for years. But moral reality is not erased by temporary human blindness. Every word intended to humiliate, every calculated betrayal, every act of manipulation, every exploitation of vulnerability carries weight. The narcissist often believes power protects them from consequence because they measure justice according to immediate outcomes. If they avoided exposure, they assume they escaped accountability. If people still admire them, they assume they were justified. But this reveals how shallow their understanding of justice truly is. Real justice is not merely about public reputation, it is about truth itself. And truth has a permanence manipulation cannot destroy. One of the reasons victims struggle to heal is because they want immediate balance restored. They want the narcissist exposed instantly. They want others to finally see what they endured. They want visible vindication. And while those desires are understandable, life does not always resolve injustice quickly. Sometimes truth moves slowly. Sometimes exposure unfolds gradually. Sometimes the narcissist continues appearing successful for a season while their victims are left carrying grief. But delayed justice is not absent justice. There is something deeply dangerous about repeatedly wounding others for personal gratification. Every time the narcissist exploits trust, they further damage their own moral perception. Every time they mock another person's pain, they harden themselves internally. And eventually this hardening affects every relationship they touch. People become objects, love becomes leverage, compassion becomes weakness. The narcissist may not notice this transformation immediately, but it is already their destiny. Meanwhile, the people they hurt are not abandoned simply because they feel abandoned. Pain has a strange way of convincing people that silence means indifference. But many of the greatest transformations in human character emerge through suffering honestly confronted. Survivors of narcissistic abuse often develop a depth of wisdom, discernment, resilience, and spiritual clarity they never possessed before. The very experience meant to destroy them can become the experience that awakens them. They begin valuing truth more deeply. They learn the importance of boundaries. They stop confusing charm with character. And perhaps most importantly, they rediscover their worth outside the narcissist's distorted perception. That is something the narcissist never understands. People are not infinitely controllable. Human beings possess souls, consciences, dignity. And while manipulation may suppress someone temporarily, truth has a remarkable tendency to resurface over time. The victim eventually begins seeing clearly again. The confusion lifts, the patterns become obvious, the illusion breaks. And when that happens, the narcissist loses one of the things they depended upon most, the ability to define reality for someone else. This is why accountability matters so deeply, not because vengeance is satisfying, but because truth restores moral order. A world without accountability becomes a world where cruelty multiplies unchecked. The narcissist thrives wherever people become too intimidated, too confused, or too exhausted to confront deception honestly. But truth does not disappear simply because it was resisted. And this is the warning woven into every act of manipulation. The people you wound may struggle, grieve, and heal slowly, but every soul you damage becomes a testimony against the life you chose to live. The narcissist's greatest mistake is not merely arrogance. It is the assumption that arrogance can sustain itself forever, for a season their life. February may appear stable, even successful. They may accumulate influence, admiration, financial gain, or social power. They may convince themselves that their manipulation is intelligence and their domination is strength. And because consequences often unfold slowly, they begin believing they have somehow escaped the laws that govern every other human being. But there is a dangerous difference between delayed collapse and permanent security. Eventually, the structure begins cracking. What makes the final downfall so devastating is that narcissists rarely prepare for it psychologically. Their entire identity depends upon control, image, and external validation. They survive by carefully managing perception. They need to feel superior, admired, desired, feared, or indispensable. But when reality begins stripping those things away, they experience something close to existential panic because they no longer know who they are without the illusion. This is why the punishment feels severe. It is not only the loss itself that destroys them, it is the confrontation with truth. A narcissist can survive many things. They can survive conflict. They can survive criticism. They can survive failed relationships because they usually rewrite those stories in ways that protect their ego. But what they struggle to survive is exposure. Genuine exposure threatens the false identity they spent years constructing. It forces them to encounter the gap between who they pretended to be and who they actually became. And reality has a way of collecting every unpaid debt eventually. The manipulator who enjoyed controlling others suddenly loses influence. The person who mocked humility finds themselves isolated. The one who treated relationships as disposable begins experiencing abandonment firsthand. The individual who weaponized deception discovers that nobody trusts them anymore. These moments are terrifying to the narcissist because their greatest fear is not panic, it is irrelevance. They can tolerate chaos more easily than insignificance. What is remarkable is how often this collapse appears sudden to outside observers, even though it has been developing internally for years. People look at the narcissist and say, "What happened?" But the truth is that collapse began the moment they started building their identity on illusion instead of character. A building with a cracked foundation may stand impressively for years before gravity finally exposes the weakness underneath. And when the collapse comes, it often unfolds in layers. First, relationships deteriorate. The narcissist eventually exhausts people emotionally. Friends become distant. Family members establish boundaries. Victims stop returning. The charm that once attracted admiration begins producing suspicion instead. Then the emotional instability intensifies. Anger increases. Paranoia grows. The narcissist becomes obsessed with maintaining control because they can feel it slipping away. Every disagreement feels like betrayal. Every boundary feels like rebellion. But the deeper punishment is spiritual. The narcissist eventually reaches a point where they can no longer distinguish between the mask and the self. They have performed superiority for so long that they become trapped inside it. And this creates a terrifying emptiness because false identities cannot nourish the soul. They can attract attention, but they cannot produce peace. They can create excitement, but not meaning. They can generate fear, but not love. Many narcissists spend years running from silence for this reason. Silence forces reflection. Reflection threatens self-awareness. And self-awareness threatens the ego they worship. So they keep distracting themselves with conflict, admiration, attention, status, or control. But eventually there comes a moment when distraction fails. The room grows quiet. The applause fades. The relationships weaken. The influence declines. And they are left alone with the very truth they spent air lives avoiding. That is often the true beginning of judgment. not simply punishment imposed from the outside, but the unbearable realization that they became strangers to goodness while convincing themselves they were powerful. They sacrificed honesty for image. They sacrificed love for control. They sacrificed humility for ego. And in the end, they discover that the false god they serve, their own pride, cannot save them from emptiness. There is a profound warning in this for everyone listening. Human beings were never designed to build their identity upon domination, vanity, or superiority. The soul cannot remain healthy while disconnected from truth. Pride always overpromises and underdelivers. It offers the illusion of greatness while slowly hollowing out the person who embraces it. And yet there is still a choice available before collapse becomes complete. Humility remains the doorway narcissists refuse to walk through. Genuine self-examination, repentance, truth. These are not forms of weakness, they are the only path back to wholeness. But pride resists them because pride would rather preserve the illusion than save the soul. And that is the tragedy at the center of every narcissistic downfall. They spent their lives trying to appear powerful while becoming weaker with every lie they told themselves.